This is how the kingdom of heaven will be. It will be like a landowner who is going on a trip. He instructed his slaves about caring for his property. He gave 5 talents to one slave, 2 to the next, and then 1 talent to the last slave, each according to his ability. Then the landowner left. Promptly, the man who had been given 5 talents went out and traded his 5 talents for 10. And the one who had received 2 talents went to the market and turned his 2 talents into 4. And the slave who had received just 1 talent, she dug a hole in the ground and buried her master's money there. Eventually, the landowner came back from his travels, found his slaves, and settled up with them. The slave who had been given 5 talents came forward and told the landowner how he'd turned 5 into 10. Then he handed the whole lot over to the landowner.
Excellent. You've proved yourself not only clever, but loyal. You've executed a rather small task masterfully, so now I'm going to put you in charge of something larger.
Hey. Your gift is overwhelming.
Then the slave who had been given 2 talents came forward and told his master how he'd turned 2 into 4, and he handed all 4 talents to the landowner.
Excellent. You've proved yourself not only clever, but loyal. You've executed a rather small task masterfully, so now I'm going to put you in charge of something larger.
Finally, the slave who had been given 1 talent came forward.
I know you're a hard man, difficult in every way. You can make a healthy sum when others would fail. You profit when other people are doing the work. You grow rich on the backs of others. So I was afraid, dug a hole, and hid the talent in the ground. Here it is. You can have it.
You are a pathetic excuse of a servant. You have disproved my trust in you and squandered my generosity. You know I always make a profit. You could have at least put this talent in the bank. Then I could have earned a little interest on it. Take that 1 talent away and give it to the servant who doubled my money from 5 to 10.
You see, everything was taken away from the man who had nothing, but the man who had something got even more. And as for the slave who made no profit but buried his talent in the ground, the landowner ordered his slaves to tie him up and throw him outside into the utter darkness where there is miserable mourning and great fear.
Thank you. Many of you know that I submitted a grant proposal in September. I have been studying and working on trying to make the words that I preach each Sunday to you better and better. And I was very excited to try to take that work in a new direction with the assistance of the grant. But this week I found out that the grant was denied. This has been a particularly painful experience for me because I not only put myself through a great deal as well as my family, but our church has done a great deal in preparation for this. Meetings have been held, preparations have been made in case the grant would have been approved, and painful words have also been said. It's been a difficult time for me, and I have appreciated your support through this more than you can know. Our story for today is a story that's probably familiar to many of you. The story you just saw enacted, the story of the talents. This is a story that Jesus taught his disciples right before he went to the cross. It's one of the very last stories in the book of Matthew. And in the story, you probably noticed that a very wealthy landowner gave away a fortune to 3 of his servants. One of them received 5 talents, one received 2, and one received 1. But even the one that received 1 talent received as much wages as he would ever need to have for the rest of his life. So what that landowner did was give away a fortune. He also told them that he was going away and that they were entrusted with taking care of the gifts that he had given them. And so the slaves did not know quite what to do because they were not given any instructions about what to do with his master's money. Each of them acted in a somewhat different way, knowing that the master would one day return and there would be an accounting for what they had done. The first 2 slaves traded with the talents. And we need to understand that in Scripture, a talent is actually money. So the first 2 slaves did what we would describe as working them in the market. They took them to the market and they traded with them. And in order to get the kind of return that they got, which was double what they were given, they would have had to take very big risks with that money because they did not know when the master was going to return. It could be 1 day, it could be 5 weeks, it could be 25 years. So that meant they had to keep trading with that money every single day to keep up that high return, knowing that on any day, their master's money might completely disappear and their master might show up. The third slave did what most of us would do, probably. Did what everyone in Jesus' day would have done. That slave took the 1 talent and hid it in the ground. People in ancient times often buried money in the ground to keep it safe. And this slave did not want anything to happen to his master's money. He didn't squander it. He didn't spend it on himself or waste it in any way. He kept it as safe as he possibly could, buried deep in the ground. And he knew for sure that whenever that master would return, that money would be there. So, why do you think that slave, that third slave, who was so very careful and cautious, received one of the angriest rebukes in all of the Bible, which you heard said up here? Why would somebody who's so careful be rebuked for it? Well, let's look at this another way. What do you think would have happened if the 2 slaves who were trading with their money and taking large risks every day had nothing when their master returned? Do you think they would have been rebuked? I don't think so. I really don't think so. I think the master would have understood the risk that they took and maybe even applauded them for their work. Sorry, of course, that their work had not produced the abundance that they hoped, but understanding that they were willing to take that risk. Why? Doesn't this all sound kind of backwards to you and me? Well, it seems that this whole story is about trust. And when the disciples heard this story, Jesus was really deeply desiring them to trust him, because he knew that the disciples did not understand what he was doing. They didn't understand why he kept thrusting himself out into dangerous places, why he kept saying things that upset people, why he was so intent on heading for Jerusalem, where he might be attacked and hung on a cross, instead of walking the roads of Galilee, where people were enjoying his teachings. The disciples couldn't have possibly understand what Jesus was doing. And so Jesus was asking them to trust him, but he also was trying to teach them something very important. He was trying to help them understand that when one has something as precious as what Jesus was going to give them, and what he was going to give them was everything, his entire life, his entire teachings, all that he was, that was going to be gifted to them. He wanted them to understand that their job wasn't to bury it in the ground. It was to take risks. Jesus wanted them to understand and know that the biggest risk of all is risking nothing. When we risk nothing, when we can't care enough about something, care about it so deeply that we would take a risk with it because we know that it might lead to something greater, but we're unwilling to do that, we are experiencing something akin to death, or what the parable describes as outer darkness. On the night of the session meeting, when we discussed the grant proposal, every elder in the session was given an opportunity to share their concerns about accepting such a venture. As we went around the room and I listened to what each person said, what was heavy in their heart, what they had heard from you, what they were worrying about, and we came to almost the end of the conversation, I started to put the paper ballots away. I didn't believe that we even needed to vote. But we did vote. All of the members of the session handed their folded paper ballots to the clerk, and the clerk began to read them. And while they were being read, and I was hearing the yeses and the nos, I felt like I was in a dream. A dream. The motion carried, and not even by a small margin. I was completely shocked. I shouldn't have been. I've worked with all of you for many years. I know that you're willing to take risks. I understand that, but I thought perhaps this one was too big. And so I learned something from you that night. I learned that you are willing to risk boldly, to love passionately, to care deeply, and to act courageously. And that is a gift that I will never forget. It is something that is eternal in my heart, in my life, something that will be there forever. I also learned that our congregation is ready for what I would call true discipleship. True discipleship is when we stand with Jesus and we risk all that we have. If there is something important enough, something that is worthy of our lives, we are ready to risk it, as Jesus risked his life. How could he have even known if his disciples would remember his teachings? How could he even know if they would go into hiding? Protect themselves? After all, the government was after Jesus. The government would come after them as well. He couldn't have known what would happen with them, but he gave it to them anyway. And he told them to be bold and spread the good news to all the world. He gave away his entire life for the world and for all the little people of the world who suffer each and every day. At the beginning of this story, we notice that the landowner gave away a fortune. That's not an unfamiliar story in Scripture, is it? It's like the beginning of creation, when God created an abundance of life, of all kinds and creatures and forms, and then gave it away to humankind and asked us to care for it. When Jesus gave his own life away for the sins of the world, all of Scripture is a story of giving away an abundance of what we have been given. We have an opportunity to do that because we have space. We have time. We can risk boldly. We can stand with Jesus and care for the needs of the poor. We can give them what we have. We can stand by those who are hurting, those who are friendless. We can stand up and make sure that this world we live in is a safe world for everyone. You see, we just have this one life. But each day of this life is a new creation. It is a day that has never happened before. And we are privileged to fashion that day with God. That is what we can do. Just this one life is all we have. And I was reminded of that this week in particular. I was reading a story about a school in California where the children were all arriving at the beginning of school around 8:30. They were being greeted by their teachers at the front door, and their parents were saying goodbye to them. They were all starting to filter into the school when all of a sudden a person came up to the school grounds with a truck and began to ram the truck through the fence that surrounded the school. When that happened, right away, all of the staff of the school went straight into action. They started to move those children inside. They started to put them into safe places. They started to lock the doors. And when they were in the midst of doing that, the custodian, who was in the back of the school, was shepherding children in too, to get them into safe places. And while he was doing that, he walked around the corner of the school and took a peek at what was going on, and he saw that there was a shooter approaching. And that custodian went out of the school building and around that corner, and he drew that man's fire. he distracted him. He was shot at also, but the gun jammed. And by the time the gun jammed and the shooting was over, all the kids, all the teachers, everyone was safe and sound inside that school. Thanks be to God. That custodian saved dozens of lives. And you know, it's a story that's hard to find in the papers. I had to dig around and look through several sources before I heard the whole story. We don't even know his name. He didn't want his name to be publicized. We only know what he did. And what he did is a gift that will last forever, for an eternity. He was there at that moment and that time, and he took a risk, and he saved lives. We also are in moments and in times in our everyday life where we have the opportunity to fashion a new day with God. And that new day with God might involve risks. It might involve protecting some of God's precious people. I am so sorry that I did not receive that grant. But I know there is work to be done. There's work for all of us to do. And I pray that God will give us all the strength that we need to save and protect and care for all of God's people in this earth, now and always.